After 17 months of fighting, Ethiopia's civil war has claimed tens of thousands of lives. As food has become scarce, famine has blighted the northern Tigray region. Medical supplies have become scarce too, and people are dying unnecessarily in Tigray's main hospital. The government had announced an indefinite humanitarian truce on the 24th of March, and leaders from the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, or TPLF, accepted the terms of the ceasefire. Now, after much delay, a convoy of trucks loaded with food will soon be on its way. But it's a fragile peace, and worries about renewed fighting have, until now, kept relief just out of reach for Tigrayans.
The government has allowed shipments of food to travel along just a single road into Tigray.
Tom Gardner is our Addis Ababa correspondent.
But since the middle of December, there have been no convoys of food aid until the beginning of this month, when the first shipment of just 20 trucks arrived in the region. So the famine is getting much worse.
But if the point of this ceasefire was to deal with the humanitarian crisis, why haven't supplies been actually making it there?
So aid workers are waiting for security clearances from the authorities in the Afar region to start moving aid trucks down the road into Tigray. The problem, officially at least, is that locals in Afar who are angry about TPLF attacks in the region, which have left hundreds of thousands homeless and hungry in the last few months, they've started attacking shipments of aid that are traveling down this road. They're demanding that the Afar region receive food aid before Tigray. One of those calling for aid to be delivered to Afar region first is the local opposition leader Musa Adam, who I spoke to recently.
So the federal government mentioned nothing about the Afar's humanitarian crisis. We are facing the same problem. Our people are dying out of hunger. So there are, huge starvations, almost nearly 700.
But what are the contingencies here? If the ceasefire hinges on these aid packages arriving, why haven't there been more arriving?
So there's currently a standoff which stems, I think, from a lack of agreement about what the ceasefire actually means. The TPLF controls the region of Tigray, or most of the region, but occupies part of the neighbouring region of Afar as well. And they basically indicated they won't withdraw their troops fully from these areas until aid starts flowing properly for a sustained period. It wants humanitarian access to be decoupled from political negotiations. The government seems to want the TPLF to withdraw fully, or at least begin the process of withdrawing back to Tigray before that. So there's a lack of clarity about what exactly the sequencing should be and no real transparent terms. Now, the latest is that the TPLF has announced it will withdraw from one district in Afar. That should, in theory, make it harder for the government to refuse those clearances for aid convoys. And indeed, just in the last few hours, another convoy was given permission to travel, though it's not many trucks. It's worth stressing, though, many people don't believe Abiy is genuinely committed to this process, that he's simply buying time in order to stave off the threat of American sanctions. So we're really going to have to wait and see now if this is really a breakthrough or not.
So what to make of this then if the tide seems to be turning? Do you think there's hope for this ceasefire in the long run?
In the last few months, fighting has been much less intense than it was last year. And I think there has been some progress when it comes to these indirect talks mediated by America and the African Union. Military commanders have made contact. Both sides have toned down their rhetoric. Since January, the government has released many Tigrayans from prison, including some TPLF leaders, and lifted a 3-month state of emergency in February. So in some respects, yes, there are grounds for thinking that the end of the war is inching closer.
And that's been contingent on the TPLF coming to the negotiating table. Why do you suppose that after all that time they decided to do so?
Last year, it looked like the TPLF was going to storm the capital, Addis Ababa. Their forces came within 160 kilometers of the city, and the prospect was of regime change. Since then, it suffered setbacks on the battlefield and has called openly and repeatedly for negotiations. I mean, it's unable to relieve the suffering of civilians in Tigray. Apart from the food shortages, there is barely any medical supplies throughout the region. There is a kind of commercial blockade imposed by the federal government they can't do much about. So no telecoms, no banking services, barely any electricity. Tens of thousands are crossing into the neighboring Amhara region to escape. The US officials I spoke to told me they were seeing around 700 people a day fleeing from Tigray into Amhara, perhaps 120,000 in total now. All of that highlights the truly desperate condition that Tigrayans now find themselves in.
And that being the case, wouldn't the government think that the TPLF is in some way on the ropes? What's their negotiating position?
That's one of the reasons for skepticism. That's why some people don't believe the government's word when it says it wants peace. That said, the government is in its own tough position. And a senior official from the ruling party told me recently that diplomatic pressure, the economy, war weariness, in that order, were the reasons behind the government's shift. So take diplomatic pressure to start with. The US Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa was in Addis Ababa just before the ceasefire was announced. America's already suspended duty-free access for Ethiopian goods. There are 2 more sanctions bills currently before Congress. Then, in addition to that, the economy is in a dire position. Spending on the war over the last year has severely exacerbated a shortage of foreign currency. Banks are running dry. Factories are cutting back for want of imported materials, and inflation, which is already topping 34%, is set to rise further thanks to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is going to have significant spillovers throughout the region.
So, in a sense, we may reach peace in this at last simply because war is too expensive for both sides.
Well, yes, exactly. The cost of war is going up. The chances of a maximalist military solution achieved by either side is looking quite unlikely. However, we're very far off, I would say, from a lasting political negotiated settlement. There are many tripwires yet which may cause this progress to founder. In recent days, lots of buses of Ethiopian troops were seen moving north towards Tigray. There are reasons to believe this is just contingency planning, but there are many in Tigray who are worried about this and may see this as an act of aggression. Similarly, TPLF leaders, for their part, they've warned of launching a new offensive of their own should aid not arrive soon. A Tigrayan diplomat told me people are losing patience and even said that if aid didn't arrive, it would be a matter of days, not weeks, before the two sides went back to war. There is certainly a high risk that the road from afar has a fork that leads straight back to war. There are still some grounds for cautious optimism, but unless aid moves down that road very quickly in large quantities, it seems inevitable that war will return.